Welcome to the Vindicta series, a series concentrating on how to paint Abaddon the Despoiler, the 40k version, not the 30k version. We do have a how to paint black tutorial on the classic forge roll miniature, but this is on the new updated plastic. So to begin the process, we undercoat the entire thing with Badger's black undercoat. Then we use opaque white to add a zenithal highlight, for the most part, onto the miniature. Now you can see with Abaddon's face how I concentrate the highlights when I'm not blurting it out on the top of the head and underneath the gorget. That way we give ourselves a beginning, an entrance into sketching the values and sketching the kind of tones we want to play with later on in the painting process. Next up, I use blue from Vallejo Air, and I'll mix this with about 1 part thinner to 1 part paint, and I'll apply it across the ultramarine on the base. Then I'll use opaque white. I get rid of most of the blue inside the cap. You don't need to get rid of every single speck, you don't need to be pedantic about it, and you airbrush that as a light highlight. Charcoal brown is then applied across the entirety of the cloak and the base. Now, why charcoal brown? Well, I don't want a rich, vibrant red. I want to contrast it with the underglow I will be giving Abaddon and the gorget. And I want this cloak to look faded. I want it to look like it used to be quite rich, had a nice rich red tone to it, but now it's over the years of battle, just over the centuries within the eye, it's faded to this orangey tone. I highlighted it with Mars Orange from Scale 75 with the airbrush, and once that's done, I will mix up a tiny amount of sandalwood, not sunny skin tone this time, sandalwood, because there's a slight amount more of purple in the mixture, and I'll use my trusty Eradicator brush. Now, if you want to find this Eradicator brush for yourself, it will be in the PDF tutorial. It's also up on the assist in the corner, but you can buy this from Rosemary & Co. You want to make sure you get the small. Now, the beauty of using this brush is that you can use different surfaces to create different effects. On the corner, we could almost give it an edge highlight using the edge of the brush. When I want to paint the inside surface, I can use just the very tip of the bristles. Messed up a space there. But take note of how I'm not too concerned about blending at this point. I want to produce texture. Whenever we use the airbrush, it produces very, very nice blended surfaces, but it does lack in detail. It lacks in grit. And this stage aims to give the grit to the piece. I want this cloak to look weather-worn, to look really beaten up. I don't want this to look like a rich Imperial cloak from some commander that's never led an Astartes into battle. No, this guy is the War Master. I want him to look really gnarled and grizzled. So in order to give that effect, in order to see the dirt beneath the fingernails, I'm adding quite a lot of it's not chips, it's not it's texture to the cloak to almost give it like a hemp feel. So just pay attention to especially the rounded surfaces. On those surfaces that haven't got much detail, I'll use the very tip of the brush, whereas on the edges, the hard surfaces of the sculpt, I'll use the edge of the brush. I can continue to build up the variance in tone by increasing the amount of sandalwood and just adding several successive layers. Then, in order to unite all these disparate tones, I will use hot orange through the airbrush, and this is about 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint. It's a very light glaze layer. And that will be it for the cloak for the moment, for the airbrushing stages and the Eradicator stage. I think we need a new term, the Eradicator stage. Okay, next up I'll use Earth from Vallejo, and I'll just sprinkle this across the surface of the miniature. Next up I take a really old battered makeup brush, and I will use birch. Just dry brush it very roughly across the surface. It's more there to give definition to the sand surrounding the miniature rather than worrying about the actual tones at this point. I can modulate them later on, and I need to see Abaddon on the base as well. It's very important that you do not finish or do not try to finish the miniature at this stage, because you're not sure how it should look if Abaddon isn't on the base. You could be painting details that will be completely obscured, or you'll have highlights that look slightly odd in context with the rest of the piece. Okay, for this battered eagle wing, I use the scale 75 gold set. I begin by using Victorian brass as a base, then use peridot alchemy to wet blend the tones together. The paint is practically undiluted. It does come out very... That's what I'm looking for. It comes out very nice at this stage. You don't need to dilute it too much. So at this stage, I'm just trying to put down the tones. I'm not really too concerned about the actual blend and fade. I'm just trying to mash the paint onto the surface of the miniature in what I think would be a pleasing highlighting and highlighting and shading scheme. I do the same thing on the ultramarine shoulder pad, beginning with Victorian. Now this is Victorian brass mixed up with Dwarven Gold 50/50 for the initial layer. Then I'll add some peridot alchemy at the very tip of the brush to begin the highlighting process. I don't wait for anything to dry at this point. I think one of the keys with working with metallics is that you use a lot of wet blending, because the metallic tone, the metallic pigment will blend in the surface. So when you look at a metallic surface, it's very hard to detect the actual brush strokes that you've used in comparison to normal acrylic paint. So when you do try to create fades with a metallic like this, you can be a bit more experimental. You can try things out. You can really try to push your wet blending abilities here. Don't worry about the actual blend itself, because you can always use glazes later on to finish it off. To add a bit of contrast to the shadows, I've used Lupercal Green, and I've again wet blended this into the shadows. Once the rest of the miniature has been painted, which you will find in accompanying videos, we need to add a few more scratches, just adding detail to the cloak with sandalwood. Now, even though this isn't strictly the process I use to paint the miniature, it's not step by step, I've instead chosen to break up the video to give you a reference point. If you wanted to know how to paint the cloak, well, all the video footage is in one video. It isn't spread out across several. So this gives you an idea of my line of thinking when editing these videos. If you want to come back to just paint the cloak, say, well, the videos they're dedicated towards that, and the precoat, etc. I only do the stage when the miniature is fully assembled to make sure I don't have any odd light reflections. When performing the stage, I take a round-headed brush, and I mainly use the tip. I'm adding scratches, incidental detail. I'm not trying to change the hue at this point. I'm not trying to add any glazes. It's purely those pinprick highlights, those minute details that really sell a paint job. That's what I'm trying to achieve here. In between all that, I'm adding a few glazes on the face with hot orange. So I'm just messing around with the face a little bit there since it was on my palette. But return back to the sandalwood. By all means, you can add some ice yellow to highlight this a little bit more if you find you haven't got the contrast by using pure sandalwood. I don't want to push the contrast too much at this point, because this isn't a highly reflective surface. This isn't a piece of ceramite or metal. This is an old, worn cloak. Now you'll notice that the colours are a lot more saturated towards the top. So if you look at his loincloth, the colours look more orange and red towards the top of his hip rather than down below, because I wanted that fade. I wanted to make it look like the bottom of his cloak has rubbed against so many surfaces. It's kind of become blackened and tarnished over the years. Right, so I'm just adding a few more chips here and there. Again, it's really artistic choice at this point, where you want to define, where you want to really highlight these areas of interest. I don't think you can really overdo this stage. You can't really underdo it either. Allow the eradicator stages to guide where you want to add the highlights, the shadows, etc. When it comes to these larger, flatter surfaces, you can see how I've splayed out the ends of my bristles to create those incidental scratches. Now you can see here I've added a tiny amount of ice yellow for the very top highlights. Make sure you get the most prominent folds of the cloak to really make it sing, really bring it to the fore, bring it to the attention of the viewer. And if so inclined, add a few chaos stars here and there, because why not? I'm sure there's space here to add all kinds of occult imagery. Why not? And that's it for the pre-coat and the cloak. Next up, you should be able to see a video accompanying this. There'll be 2 released on the same weekend. Hope you enjoy it, and brothers, Vindicta.